Alarming video this week of Russian attack jets repeatedly buzzing, a U.S. Navy destroyer in the Baltic Sea. The Russian warplanes flew 31 passes over 2 days, coming at least on one pass within 30 feet of the ship. And we're back now with the panel. Well, we asked you for questions for our Sunday group, and we got a bunch of questions from you for the panel on these provocations. Jan PC sent this on Facebook. Why wasn't Putin given a message that if this happens again, he will be looking in the ocean for his planes? We are so weak. And William J. Smith tweeted this: what would Putin do if we buzzed one of their ships? George, how do you answer William and Jan, and what do you make of the Russian actions and the U.S. response?
Well, it's a very good question, because the destroyer Donald Cook was further than 70 nautical miles from Soviet Russian territory. So there's no question about this being a provocation. During the Cold War, I think it was Henry Kissinger likened the Soviet Union to a burglar that goes down a hallway in a hotel trying all the doorknobs to see if he can find one that's unlocked. This is that kind of constant probing we got used to. Astonishingly, to me at least, Secretary of State Kerry said under the rules of engagement, this would have justified our shooting down that plane. I would love to know what those rules of engagement are, because this is pertinent to what's going on daily in the South China Sea, where the United States is testing. We're sort of in the semi-aggressor role here, and should be. We're testing the claims made by the Chinese about their rights over territorial waters surrounding the islands they're manufacturing and militarizing. So this is a new sphere of superpower, 3 or 4 superpowers, confronting one another.
What should we have done?
I think we should have elaborated on what Mr. Kerry said, that if the rules of engagement say we can shoot this plane down, the Russians should know that.
Let me ask you, Julie, because as George just pointed out, you got Kerry taking a very strong stand about what at least we could have done, not what we did do. And then you had the White House spokesman, Josh Earnest, saying that this raises serious safety concerns, and basically strong letter to follow to the Russians. Any second thoughts at the White House about how they handled this?
I don't think second thoughts about how they handled this particular incident. It's a very difficult situation, because on the one hand, you see this video, and to actually see how close these planes are getting, it's very unnerving. Yet you're
and honestly, you know, I mean, we can sit there and say, well, it was a provocation. You didn't know as that plane is heading over the horizon what its intent was.
30 times. So on the one hand, it's very unnerving to see this happen. You also, though, don't expect that the U.S. military is going to take action and shoot down these planes. And Putin knows that he can probably get away with this. So it's a bit of a catch-22 for this administration. But to George's point, when you talk to military experts and foreign policy experts, yes, they'll raise ISIS, yes, they'll raise Iran as big concerns, but what's happening in these waters around the world between Russia, the U.S., and China, it is potentially a really scary situation.
When you talk to your sources, was there any discussion about let's put more troops in the Baltics to at least say, hey, look, you know, you want to be provocative with us? We're going to show you that we're not going to be cowed.
It didn't seem like this provoked that kind of response. I think that Putin could use this as a tactic that he could keep pressing to see how far he could go before he does get some kind of response, but no sign that this what we saw the last couple of days is going to provoke that response.
Rebecca, there's also a political component to this because Hillary Clinton was one of the architects of the Russian reset when she was Secretary of State. Our effort, apparently, at least in the long term, having failed to improve and warm up relations with Russia. Do you see this, just not only the Russian issue, but her whole record as Secretary of State being a problem for her, not necessarily just an unalloyed success for her as we get into the general election?
Well, Republicans certainly hope to make it so. Her campaign, and Republicans really see her experience as Secretary of State on foreign policy as potentially her greatest asset in a general election, because it's something that none of her Republican rivals could potentially match. But if Republicans are able, and they've already been trying, to take this asset for her, turn it into a liability by pointing to her record on Russia with the reset, Libya, Syria, Iran, these countries where she was hoping, and the president was hoping, frankly, to make them more stable, and instead they have veered more into instability, and Russia has veered more into provoking the U.S. as opposed to the opposite, which was the goal of the Russia reset. Republicans, by highlighting these issues and highlighting Hillary Clinton's performance on these issues, could turn her experience into a liability potentially.
Laura, I want to turn to another hot spot. President Obama travels to Saudi Arabia this week, and there was a fascinating story in the New York Times yesterday that top Saudi officials have said that they are prepared to sell off hundreds of billions of dollars in Russia in their assets that they have here in the United States if Congress goes ahead and passes a law that basically says that Saudi officials, the Saudi government, could be liable in any suits involving 9/11 and the role they might have played in 9/11. Your thoughts about that?
Well, it's dangerous for the United States, frankly, to go into so much debt where we're borrowing money, and we're printing these treasury bills, borrowing money, obviously huge amount of money from China, but obviously Saudi Arabia, $750 million isn't a drop in the bucket. It's $750 million. Now, whether Saudi Arabia will do this or not, we don't really know. It would actually hurt them to do it. However, the more interesting thing about all of this is what's come out of those redacted 28 pages from the 9/11 Commission when we find out for sure that in San Diego, 2 of the 9/11 hijackers were facilitated out of the Saudi embassy. There's a flurry of phone calls. That information has been leaked out of that report. I think the American people need to know those 28 pages should be released.
Let me just briefly explain. Actually, it wasn't the 9/11 Commission. It was a congressional probe. In 2002, there was a congressional probe about 9/11 the year before, and 28 pages of that are still classified all these years later, and that reportedly may link some Saudi officials, individual officials, to support for the 9/11 hijackers. What makes this especially interesting is the 9/11 Commission, separate group from the congressional probe, said this. It found, quote, no evidence that the Saudi government as an institution or senior Saudi officials individually funded the organization, meaning al-Qaeda. I got to say, Julie, that looks like it was written by a lawyer and couldn't be more narrowly worded.
Absolutely. And when you look at the complex relationship that we have with Saudi Arabia right now, President Obama is going to be there this coming week, his 4th visit as president. This has been a question that has hung over this relationship for a long time, where you will have officials that will say things like, well, we know there was money or guidance emanating out of the kingdom, but they always stop short of saying that it was actually orchestrated by the government or senior people within the government. And when you know that there are 28 pages hanging out there that will clarify, presumably, what the ties were, I think that it could put the administration in a difficult spot if they're taking action to try to hold off on releasing that.
So Laura, I mean, just to go back to you, I mean, on the one hand, you've got members of Congress who want to pass this law that would make the Saudi government liable in court, and what we're particularly talking about here are families of the 9/11 victims who want to sue the Saudi government, which obviously has deep pockets, and then you've also got this kind of ticking time bomb, these 28 pages that a separate investigation conducted that may have evidence about what the Saudis did, and that up to this point the administration has refused to declassify.
Everyone should read Paul Sperry's piece in today's New York Post from the Hoover Institution. He goes through all of this meticulously, and Prince Bandar, a good friend of the Bushes, obviously on September 13th, shared cigars on the Truman balcony after 9/11. Prince Bandar, from some of the $130,000 from then Saudi ambassador Prince Bandar's family's checking account to yet another of the hijackers' Saudi handlers in San Diego. This is stuff that's already come out of those 28 pages. We have to know what was in this. And if there's facilitation, which it certainly looks like, from some of these Saudi officials to the handlers who are helping the hijackers in San Diego. San Diego is where it looks like it happened. This is devastating. And why were we in such a rush to get these people out of the United States after 9/11? That's all in this piece. People should read it. It's complicated, but it's worth reading, because if we're engaged in this cover-up, then this goes back many, many years.
George, we have less than a minute left. Your thoughts about the Saudi role in 9/11 and what? Because it's a complicated issue. What should the U.S. do? What should the administration do?
Well, the United States should release this information as the 9/11 Commission unanimously requested that they be released. When the investigations into 9/11 began, the primary question was it just a weird coincidence that 15 of 19 hijackers were from Saudi Arabia? The answer is of course not. First, by funding Wahhabism, the radical Islami doctrine, and by it's now clear, probably out of the Los Angeles Saudi consulate, they were helping these hijackers.
Well, it'll be interesting to see what comes up in the president's trip this week. Thanks, panel. See you next Sunday.